Alright, here we go with our last video for chapter 6, looking at classical Americas. And this time we're going to look at the end of the classical period in world history. And we're going to look at some of the causes and some of the effects of the collapse of numerous civilizations across the world, from the Mayans in Mesoamerica, the Moche in South America, Rome throughout the Mediterranean, Gupta India, and Han China. So basically, what happens is we see the collapse of these large empires, right? Rome, Han, and Gupta. And even though they had numerous reasons for their slow decline and eventual collapse, uh, we see that the internal problems that they were facing were increased when we see the arrival of nomadic invasions, right? So the Romans, they have the Germanic tribes entering. In China, we have the Central Asian nomadic people coming in. And in the Guptas, we have the White Huns. So these external invaders are coming in and kind of just increasing the number of problems that the empires was already undergoing. And eventually, within a 300-year time period, starting off with Han and ending up with the Guptas, we see the eventual collapse of all of these large centralized classical empires. We also see roughly around the same time the decline in the fall of other empires, or not empires, but civilizations, like the Mayans and the Moche and Teotihuacan in the Americas. And it's not necessarily external threats that cause those problems, but it's more likely environmental effects that led to those decline. Now, one of the effects of the collapse of the political order is that the people who are living during this time, they're going to start searching for some type of escape or some type of belief that will keep, give kind of like meaning to the chaos that they're living through. And what happens is we see the increased popularity of different religions, right? As things are getting bad, more and more people turn to religion for not only salvation but for some form of safety, right? In that, people with the same religion are gonna try to work together and survive together. So in China, we see the increased popularity of Buddhism and Taoism. In the western parts of Europe, we see Christianity become greater and greater, right? And of course, the Catholic Church of Western Europe will increase its influence there as well. And in India, we see the increased popularity of Hinduism, right? Remember, Hinduism kind of continues that social order of the caste system. So even though the political structures might be changing, right, the social structures remain the same. And remember, these religions had spread and traveled across Afro-Eurasia, thanks to the trade networks that were being used during this time. Now, when we look at trade, we also need to understand that when there's a lot of political chaos, meaning there's a lot of violence and instability, trade is going to be disrupted, because if you're a merchant who has to sail across the sea or or walk across a trade network, walk across a road, it becomes increasingly dangerous for you to travel with merchandise, because you're an easy target, right? When those classical empires were up and running and they protected their borders and established safety, then it was very easy for a merchant to travel. But now, with the chaos, with the political problems, trade is going to decline. Some places, some trade networks are going to decline more than others. So, for example, maritime trade in Western Europe, right? So, like Spain, France, Northern Africa, Italy, right? That's Western Mediterranean. That's going to decline, right? Because the Western Roman Empire will collapse. The Silk Road, right? Going from East Asia, from China, right across Central Asia, into India, into the Mediterranean, through Persia, right? All of that's going to decline, because again, now you have all these nomadic people coming in, and the empires that control these territories are too weak to stop the violence, too weak to stop the invasions, and therefore they're not going to be able to protect the trade networks anymore. So the overland trade is going to be very weakened as well. Now, the ones that are not going to be affected as much is going to be the Indian Ocean Trade Network, right? Because Southeast Asia, they're going to continue being the way they've always been. and they're not going to go through any collapse. Southern parts of India, which were never part of the Gupta Empire, they're going to keep things up and running. Eastern Europe, Arabia, Eastern Africa and Arabia, and even Persia, they're gonna not gonna be there. There's no great collapse of empire there either. So their trade is going to continue. So the Indian Ocean Trade Network, right, the Indian Ocean Basin, is not going to be affected as much, right? The volume of trade is going to decline because there's going to be less customers, wanting goods from China or goods from the Mediterranean. But overall, this trade network will continue. The same thing will happen with the Eastern Mediterranean that we will see around here, right? Because if you recall, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that controlled the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of the Middle East and Anatolia or Turkey and Greece, right, and Egypt, all this region of the Eastern Mediterranean will continue being run by another empire that kind of continues the Roman legacy, and that is the Byzantine Empire, which we'll read about in chapter 7. So this region, this trade network kind of isn't affected as much, and neither is the Indian Ocean. All right, so here we see again those great empires of that time, and the trade networks that they would have linked to them. Right, so the Han, the Romans, the Guptas that would have been here. Right, those are slowly going to decline and fall apart. Right, the Persian Empire. Right, by then it would have been called the Parthenon Empire or the Parthian Empire. They would have continued. Right, and other places you see the trade networks linking them together. They would have continued as well. So, with the collapse of these empires, you see decentralization kind of take root in these three different regions, right? So, Western Europe, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we see that Western Europe is going to enter what they call the Dark Ages, which is going to last for a good 500 years. And the truth is that Europe is never ever going to be reunited, re-centralized under one ruler ever again, even though there's going to be many attempts to do so. So Europe will become fragmented, Europe will become decentralized, and that's kind of the way it will remain. India is going to also fall back into its traditional kind of normal status, which is a lot of decentralized kingdoms and independent city states, kind of just each one ruling their own little territory. And it isn't until about 600 years after the fall of the Guptas that we see a new kind of like group come and take over the various kingdoms and city states of India. Um, and then China, they're going to be broken apart again into a kind of what we would call a second warring state period, which is called the Three Kingdom period. And they won't get united until around 600 CE. So they're going to be the kind of the first ones to get reunited of the three that are listed here. So we have decentralization politically. We see disruption of trade. We see the increased popularity of religion and spirituality. So here we're looking at is the periodization, right? So this is what we just finished. We finished time period 2, okay, which ends in 600 CE. And of course, the little c with the period, that means that this is circa. So there is no exact date saying like, okay, you're now in the classical era or you are now in the post-classical era. So these are kind of like these date ranges. They're invented by historians. So the people back then wouldn't have said, "Oh, I lived in the classical era," because that didn't exist. But we organize these time periods we organize these time periods to kind of make sense of what's happening in world history. So 600 CE is the marking point, right? After 600 CE, we're gonna start with time period 3. Right, the nickname for that one is the post-classical, right, or the after the classical era. All right, and that's gonna run all the way to 1450. So why is 600 CE the marking point, right? What is so special about that year or that time of 600 CE that kind of separates these two time periods, right? Period 2 from period 3. And it kind of go back to what we mentioned a while ago with time period 1 and 2. Okay, what is it between time period 1 and 2 that separates the two, right? And the main thing is the rise of the Persians, right? The Persian Empire kind of becomes the first of the classical empires, and they kind of the size and the scope of this classical empire is bigger than anything we had seen with the ancient Mesopotamians or the ancient Egyptians or the ancient people of the Indus Valley or of the or in China, right? So the rise of the Persian kind of creates the pattern of classical empires, right? So what is it that separates the classical from the post-classical? Well, it's a religion, and it's Islam, right? 600 CE is considered, well, in world history time, the beginning of the religion and the growth and the expansion of Islam, right? Which we haven't even gotten to yet, because that's going to be in chapter 8. So before 600 CE, there is no Islam, right? And the arrival of Islam after 600 CE is going to kind of be the defining moment of the next time period, right? Also, of course, the collapse of all the classical empires that we just mentioned will also be kind of the turning point between time period 2 and time period 3. But even then, there's a lot of historical debate as to whether or not 600 is the correct time frame, right? Because if we're looking at Western European history, right, the time period should be 476 CE, because in Western Europe, that's the turning point, right? In 476 CE, that's when the Western Roman Empire collapses, and that's when the Middle Ages begins, right? But if you're in the Americas, like let's say you're living in the Mayan civilization, right? Their civilization doesn't end until around 900 CE. So my point is that you have different historical perspectives, right? Depending on where you're looking at, what part of the world, to look at this, why is this one period, why does it end? So again, another example would be that in China, the classical period for China ends in 220 CE, right? Almost 400 years before the the official time of 600. So my point is that when we look at periodization, we look at the kind of different arguments that historians have to kind of divide history into these huge time periods, right? And there is no definitive answer, right? Even though this is the official one that we use for our course for AP World History, it doesn't mean that all of history will neatly and easily fall under this time period or these separations between the time periods. And so there's always an argument, which leads to the type of one of the many types of essays that you're going to write, which is the periodization essay, which is when you look at events in history and try to figure out, how important they were and how significant they were, and whether or not they're going to be a shift or a change in the time period of the world, right? And that's going to be an essay for the future. All right, so that's it for your final video on Chapter 6, your final video for Unit 2. Thanks for watching.